I'm Harper, 32 years old, and I always believed family meant unconditional love. After years away, I returned home for Thanksgiving, hoping to find warmth in old memories. Instead, while flipping through our family album, I discovered something horrifying. Every single photo of me had been methodically torn out. That night, I prepared a special envelope. When they opened it at dinner, my mother cried and my father went silent. Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from. Give this video a like if you've ever felt erased from your own family's history. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago in what appeared to be the picture-perfect American family. My father, William, worked as an accountant at a respected firm, maintaining steady employment throughout my childhood. He was quiet, methodical, and rarely raised his voice. My mother, Margaret, taught 4th grade at the local elementary school, beloved by students, but a different person behind closed doors. My older brother James was 5 years my senior and seemed to excel at everything he touched. Our house on Maple Street was well maintained with a manicured lawn that my father proudly tended every weekend. We had Sunday dinners together, took annual summer vacations to Michigan, and participated in all the expected holiday traditions. From the outside, we appeared to be the ideal family unit. I was always the artistic one, drawn to colors and shapes from the moment I could hold a crayon. My earliest memories involved creating elaborate drawings that covered our refrigerator, while James brought home perfect report cards filled with, as I brought home, art projects. The difference in how these achievements were received became apparent early on. "Look at these math scores," my mother would exclaim, posting James's tests prominently on the fridge. My artwork would eventually be moved to make room for his newest accomplishments. There were subtle signs of favoritism that I brushed off as a child. James got the bigger bedroom, the newer clothes, the first choice at dessert. Small things that accumulated over time, like tiny paper cuts to my sense of belonging. When I would point these discrepancies out, my mother would say, "James is older," or "James needs more space for his studies." The one person who saw me for who I truly was my grandmother Eleanor. She lived about 30 minutes away, and visits to her house became my sanctuary. Grandma Eleanor had been an art teacher before retiring, and she had a small studio in her basement where she taught me techniques that nurtured my passion. "You see the world differently, Harper," she would tell me as we painted together. "That's a gift, not a flaw." When I was 10, I entered a regional art contest without telling my parents. Grandma Eleanor helped me submit my watercolor painting of our local park. When I won first place, I was ecstatic. The local newspaper even published a small article about it, which Grandma carefully cut out and presented to my parents over dinner. "Well, that's nice," my mother said, glancing at the clipping before changing the subject to James's recent academic decathlon victory. That same week, my parents threw a small party to celebrate James getting accepted into a prestigious summer science program. They invited extended family and neighbors. My art contest victory went unmentioned. On my 13th birthday, Grandma Eleanor gave me my first camera. It was nothing fancy, a simple point-and-shoot digital model, but it changed everything for me. I became obsessed with capturing moments, finding beauty in ordinary things, and documenting life around me. "You have an eye for composition," Grandma would say, looking through my photos. "You capture feelings, not just images." My father remained passive throughout my childhood. He never actively participated in the favoritism, but he never stopped it either. He would occasionally give me a sympathetic look across the dinner table when my mother was praising James, but he never spoke up. His silence became a form of complicity that hurt almost as much as my mother's active dismissal. Thanksgiving was always an elaborate affair in our household. Mother insisted on perfection, from the table settings to the perfectly browned turkey. These gatherings amplified the family dynamics. James would be showcased to relatives, asked about his accomplishments and future plans. I would be an afterthought, occasionally asked about those pictures you take, as though my passion was just a passing hobby. By the time I reached high school, I had internalized a lot of these messages. I stopped sharing my photographs with my parents. I stopped expecting them to attend my art shows. I focused instead on building relationships with friends who appreciated my creative vision and teachers who encouraged my talent. But deep down, that little girl who just wanted her parents to post her artwork on the fridge still existed. She still hoped that one day they would look at her work with the same pride they showed when looking at James's academic achievements. That hope, however faint, kept me tethered to a family that increasingly felt less like home. When it came time for college applications, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I applied to several art schools focusing on photography programs. My high school portfolio had won several awards, and my photography teacher had connections that helped me secure interviews at competitive programs. The acceptance letter from the New York Institute of Photography arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I held the envelope in trembling hands, hardly believing that I had been accepted with a partial scholarship. This was everything I had worked toward, a validation of my talent and a pathway to the future I envisioned for myself. That evening, I placed the acceptance letter on the dining table before dinner. My parents and James took their usual seats, and I waited for them to notice the envelope. "I got accepted," I said when no one commented, "to the photography program in New York, with a scholarship." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother put down her fork and looked at my father, who suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. "New York," my mother finally said. "That's completely impractical, Harper. We discussed this. The State University has a fine arts program and you could live at home." "We didn't discuss anything," I countered. "You told me what you thought I should do, but this is what I want." What followed was the most heated argument we had ever had. My mother listed all the reasons why pursuing photography was a mistake. The instability, the competitiveness, the low chances of success. My father remained largely silent, occasionally muttering that we should keep open minds. "This family has survived worse disappointments," my mother eventually said, her voice cold and final. The words landed like a physical blow. I wasn't just making a choice she disagreed with. I was a disappointment. A survival challenge for the family. James, who was home from his second year of pre-med studies, tried to play peacemaker in his condescending way. "Maybe she needs to get this out of her system," he suggested, as though my passion was a phase to overcome rather than a calling to pursue. 2 months later, I packed my belongings and moved to New York with minimal help from my parents. They provided the bare minimum financially that they felt obligated to contribute, but their emotional support was non-existent. Grandma Eleanor drove me to the airport, slipping me an envelope with some extra cash and a handwritten note that simply read, "Capture the world, my darling." New York was everything I had hoped for and more challenging than I had anticipated. The city's energy was intoxicating, but the program was demanding and competitive. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who took photography as seriously as I did, who understood the language of light and composition that had always felt like my native tongue. I made friends quickly with a diverse group of fellow artists. Maya was a sculptor from California with vibrant blue hair and infectious enthusiasm. Zoe was a quiet photographer from Seattle whose documentary work inspired me to push boundaries. And then there was Ethan, a film student with intense eyes and a habit of quoting obscure directors. We became inseparable during that first semester, and by winter break, we were dating. When I called home, the conversations were brief and surface level. My mother asked about classes, but showed little interest in my actual work. My father asked if I needed money, but rarely inquired about my experiences. James, when he happened to be home during my calls, would take the phone briefly to deliver updates about his medical school applications, as though we were exchanging comparable news. The frequency of these calls diminished over time. During my freshman year, I called home weekly. By sophomore year, it was monthly. The conversations never deepened, never bridged the growing distance. Meanwhile, my work began to gain recognition. A series of black and white photographs I took of elderly immigrants in my neighborhood were selected for the school's showcase gallery. A small local arts magazine featured 3 of my images. These were modest accomplishments in the grand scheme of things, but they were affirming stepping stones. I sent copies of the magazine to my parents. My mother called to say she had received it, but spent most of the conversation talking about James's acceptance to medical school. He had followed the expected path, prestigious university stellar grades medical school at Johns Hopkins. He had also started dating Catherine, the daughter of my father's boss, a relationship my mother described as perfect in every way. My financial situation was always precarious. The scholarship covered only part of my tuition, and New York's cost of living was astronomical compared to suburban Chicago. I worked part-time jobs between classes and on weekends barista retail gallery assistant. When a particularly rough month left me unable to make rent, I swallowed my pride and called home for help. "We're already paying for your tuition, Harper," my mother said. "You chose this expensive school and city. You need to figure it out." What she didn't say, but what I knew, was that they had fully funded James's undergraduate education and were now contributing significantly to his medical school expenses. They had even helped with the down payment on his condo. The disparity was glaring, but bringing it up would only lead to another argument about my impractical choices. Thanksgiving visits became increasingly strained affairs. I would save up for the plane ticket home, endure the polite interrogations about when I would get a real job, and listen to extended monologues about James's brilliant future in medicine. One year, I noticed that none of my photographs were displayed anywhere in the house, though James's graduation portraits and medical school acceptance letter were prominently framed in the living room. During my junior year, Grandma Eleanor's health began to decline. I visited her as often as I could afford to, taking the train from New York to Chicago during long weekends. During these visits, I would stay with her rather than at my parents' house, photographing her hands, her smile, her garden, preserving pieces of her as she gradually faded. She passed away during finals week of my junior year. I rushed home for the funeral, arriving just hours before the service. The family dynamics were on full display even in grief. James delivered a polished eulogy that focused more on his memories than on Grandma herself. My mother managed the arrangements with efficient detachment. When I asked if I could say a few words about what Grandma meant to me, my mother said the program was already finalized. At the reception afterward, several of Grandma's old art students approached me, sharing stories of her teaching and mentioning how often she had spoken of me with pride. "She carried your photos in her purse," one elderly woman told me, squeezing my hand. "Showed them to everyone at the senior center." These words were both healing and heartbreaking. The person who had most believed in me was gone, and I felt more like an outsider in my family than ever before. After graduation, I remained in New York, determined to make a career in photography, despite the challenges. The city's art scene was notoriously competitive, with thousands of talented artists vying for limited opportunities. I shared a tiny apartment in Brooklyn with Zoe and Maya, all of us working multiple jobs while pursuing our creative passions. My first post-college position was as an assistant to a commercial photographer who specialized in product photography for catalogs and websites. The work was technical and uncreative, but it paid consistently and taught me valuable skills about lighting and studio management. In my free time, I continued developing my personal portfolio, focusing on intimate portraits and street photography that captured human connections. 6 months after graduation, I met Sophia Mendez at a gallery opening. Sophia was a well-established photographer in her 50s, whose work had been featured in major publications. She took an interest in my portfolio and offered me a position as her assistant. This opportunity changed everything. Sophia became not just an employer, but a mentor who pushed me to refine my vision. "You have raw talent," she told me during our first portfolio review. "But talent isn't enough. You need discipline and a unique perspective. Find what makes your eye different from everyone else's." Under Sophia's guidance, I developed a more cohesive body of work. She helped me secure my first solo exhibition at a small but respected gallery in Chelsea. The exhibition, titled Blood Ties, featured a series of portraits exploring family relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was gaining recognition for depicting the very connections I felt were missing in my own life. The opening night of Blood Ties was a modest success. Art critics from several online publications attended, and 2 pieces sold to collectors. Sophia brought industry contacts who expressed interest in my work. It wasn't a breakthrough moment, but it was a meaningful step forward. I sent my parents an invitation to the opening, knowing they wouldn't attend, but holding on to a sliver of hope nonetheless. They sent a brief email wishing me luck, but explaining that they couldn't make it because James was presenting a research paper that weekend, and they had already committed to attending. My calls home had become increasingly rare, reduced to major holidays and parents' birthdays. Each conversation followed a predictable pattern: brief inquiries about my work that barely masked their disapproval, updates about James that implied comparison, and subtle suggestions that I consider more stable career paths. James had completed medical school and was now in a prestigious residency program. He had married Catherine in a lavish wedding that my parents spoke about for months. When I attended, I felt like a guest rather than family, seated at a table with distant cousins instead of at the family table. James and I barely spoke beyond polite pleasantries. We had become strangers, connected only by shared DNA. A year after my first exhibition, I received unexpected recognition when my work was featured in American Photography, a prominent magazine in the field. The 4-page spread included an interview where I discussed my approach to capturing human vulnerability. It was my most significant professional accomplishment to date. I sent a copy of the magazine to my parents, allowing myself to hope that this external validation might finally help them see the legitimacy of my path. The magazine arrived during a week when James had published a medical research paper, creating an unintended comparison that I should have anticipated. When my mother called, I could hear the magazine pages turning in the background. My heart lifted momentarily, thinking she might actually comment on the photographs or the interview. "I noticed several grammatical errors in your quotes," she said instead. "You should be more careful about how you present yourself in public. People judge these things." That was it. No congratulations, no recognition of the achievement, just criticism about grammar in an interview that had been transcribed by someone else. I remained silent on the phone, a familiar emptiness expanding in my chest. "Did you see that James's research was mentioned in the Journal of Medicine?" She continued, not noticing or caring about my silence. "They're saying his approach to pediatric diagnostics could become standard protocol." After that call, I made a decision that was both painful and necessary. I would stop seeking their approval. I would stop sending them my work. I would stop hoping for a relationship that clearly wasn't possible. I reduced communication to bare minimum, declining the next Thanksgiving invitation with the excuse of work obligations. It wasn't entirely untrue. I had taken on a commercial project that required my attention, but I could have negotiated the timing if I had wanted to. For 3 years, I maintained this distance. I visited Chicago only once during that period, when my father had a minor surgical procedure. The visit lasted less than 48 hours, and I stayed at a hotel rather than the family home. I sent obligatory birthday and Christmas cards with generic messages. I answered their infrequent calls with polite detachment. During those 3 years, my career steadily advanced. Sophia connected me with editorial opportunities at magazines and fashion brands. My fine art photography gained representation at a respected gallery. I developed a distinctive style that combined documentary realism with emotional intimacy, creating images that critics described as haunting and powerfully vulnerable. I built a chosen family among fellow artists and friends. Zoe remained my closest friend, now working as a photojournalist for international publications. Maya had opened a small gallery featuring emerging sculptors. Ethan and I had parted ways romantically, but maintained a creative partnership, occasionally collaborating on projects that combined still photography with film. These relationships provided the emotional support and recognition that had been missing from my family connections. They celebrated my achievements without qualification. They offered honest criticism without undermining my worth. They created a space where I felt fully seen. But beneath the new life I had constructed, the wound of family rejection remained tender. Nights alone in my apartment, I would sometimes look through old photographs from childhood, searching for clues to when and why the distance had begun. Had I been too sensitive, too different, too unwilling to conform to expectations? Or had the dynamics been set long before I could influence them? These questions circled in my mind, particularly during holidays, when the absence of family connections felt most acute. But I had made peace with the situation, or so I thought, until an unexpected phone call disrupted the careful boundaries I had established. The call came on a Tuesday evening in early November. I was editing photos from a recent magazine assignment when my phone lit up with my father's name. My first instinct was concern. He rarely called except for major events or emergencies. "Harper," he said. When I answered, his voice sounding older than I remembered, "Your mother had a health scare last week." My stomach tightened. Despite everything, the thought of my mother seriously ill triggered a complex wave of emotions. "What happened? Is she okay?" I asked, setting aside my laptop. "She's stable now. It was her heart. Not a full attack, but the doctors called it a warning sign. She's on medication and needs to rest." He paused, then added, "She's been asking for you." The skeptical part of me wondered if this was manipulation, a way to draw me back into the fold on their terms. But my father's voice carried a weariness that seemed genuine. "Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks," he continued. "We would really like you to come home this year. It would mean a lot." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Perhaps it was a lingering sense of duty, or maybe the health scare had sparked a hope that near loss might soften the family dynamics. I arranged for a colleague to cover my scheduled shoots and booked a flight to Chicago for the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. As the trip approached, my anxiety escalated. I had nightmares about family confrontations. I rehearsed responses to potential criticisms or dismissals. I considered cancelling multiple times. Zoe talked me through these moments, helping me establish boundaries for the visit. "You're not the same person who left," she reminded me. "You're stronger now. You know who you are." The flight to Chicago felt like travelling back in time. As familiar landscapes appeared below, memories surfaced with increasing intensity. By the time the taxi turned onto Maple Street, my heart was racing. The house looked exactly the same, neat lawn, trimmed hedges, American flag by the door. It was as though the past 3 years had never happened. My father answered the door, looking older and more stooped than I remembered. His hair had greyed significantly, and new lines mapped his face. "Harper," he said with an awkward half-smile. "Good to have you home." The word home struck me as incorrect. This house hadn't felt like home for a very long time. My mother was in the living room, seated in her favourite armchair. She had lost weight, and her usually perfect hair showed signs of neglect. When she saw me, she straightened her posture but didn't rise. "You cut your hair," she said by way of greeting, referencing my shoulder-length bob that had replaced the long hair of my youth. 3 years ago, I replied, setting my bags down. "How are you feeling?" "Better." The doctors exaggerated the situation. She adjusted a throw pillow beside her. "Your room is ready, same as always." The interaction set the tone for the evening. Dinner was a quiet, strained affair with conversation limited to safe topics, weather, traffic, neighborhood changes. Neither parent asked about my life in New York or my work. I didn't volunteer information. James and his family would arrive the following day. They had bought a house in a wealthy Chicago suburb after James had secured a position at a prestigious medical practice. They now had 2 children, a 5-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, whom I had only seen in the Christmas card photos my parents forwarded. After dinner, I retreated to my childhood bedroom, which was indeed same as always. My high school textbooks still lined the bookshelf. The same bland beige comforter covered the bed. The walls remained unadorned, save for a single framed landscape print my mother had selected years ago. None of my photographs had ever been displayed here. The preservation of the room in its teenage state felt less like nostalgia and more like a denial of my adult identity. It was as though my parents were holding space for a version of me that might eventually conform to their expectations, rather than acknowledging who I had actually become. That night, unable to sleep in the too familiar yet uncomfortably foreign space, I decided to look through old family albums. Perhaps reconnecting with childhood memories would help me navigate the coming days with more grace. I slipped downstairs to the living room, where the albums had always been kept in the bottom shelf of the bookcase. The leather-bound albums were arranged chronologically, just as my mother had always organized them. I pulled out one labeled Family 2000-2005, covering my early teenage years. As I opened it, confusion washed over me. Pages that should have contained my school photos and dance recitals showed ragged edges where images had been removed. Flipping further, I discovered that every single photo that should have included me had been torn out. In disbelief, I grabbed another album, this one from earlier childhood years. The same pattern emerged. Every photo featuring me had been methodically removed. Group family photos remained, but with my image torn away, leaving jagged holes where I should have been. Album after album revealed the same treatment. 2 decades of family history had been curated to erase my existence. Some of the tear marks seemed recent, with fresh paper edges and disturbed dust patterns, suggesting this wasn't an old project. My hands trembled as I returned the albums to their shelf. The physical removal of my image felt like the perfect metaphor for my place in the family, present in theory, but deliberately excised in practice. It was one thing to suspect I was the family disappointment. It was another to find such tangible proof of systematic erasure. Back in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, silent tears streaming down my face. The discovery crystallized years of feeling excluded and undervalued. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a difference in communication styles. This was active rejection. I texted Zoe knowing she'd still be awake in New York. They tore me out of all the family photos, literally cut me out of the albums. Her response came immediately. "That's beyond messed up. You okay?" "No," I replied honestly, "but I'm going to be." Instead of immediate confrontation, I decided to be strategic. This visit wouldn't end with me feeling victimized or apologizing for who I was. I began formulating a plan, a way to address the album discovery that would allow me to reclaim my narrative and establish clear boundaries going forward. In my suitcase was a folder containing magazine features of my work newspaper articles about my exhibitions and announcements from galleries. I had brought them not to show my parents, but as a personal reminder of my journey when being in this house threatened to make me feel small again. Now these documents would serve a different purpose. I stayed up late arranging these items in a large envelope, adding a handwritten note that expressed what I had never been able to say aloud. As the night deepened into early morning, I felt a strange calm replace the initial shock and hurt. I was no longer seeking approval. I was claiming space for my truth, regardless of how it was received. Thanksgiving morning dawned with a flurry of activity. My mother, despite doctor's orders to rest, insisted on overseeing every aspect of the meal preparation. Her need for control seemed even more pronounced after her health scare, as though perfecting a turkey might somehow restore her sense of order. "Harper, you can peel the potatoes," she instructed, assigning me the most basic task while she handled the more complex components of the meal. Even in the kitchen, hierarchy was maintained. I worked silently, watching her efficient movements around the kitchen. Despite our differences, I couldn't help but admire her competence. She had always been a masterful cook, transforming even ordinary ingredients into memorable dishes. "Is the table set exactly as I diagrammed?" she asked, not looking up from the cranberry sauce she was stirring. "Yes," I confirmed, having followed her detailed instructions for place settings, complete with name cards and specific arrangements of silverware. My own name card had been placed at the far end of the table, as distant from the head positions as possible. The doorbell rang around 11, announcing James's arrival. My father hurried to welcome them, his voice immediately warming to a tone I rarely heard directed at me. "There's my boy, and look at these beautiful grandchildren." James entered the kitchen with Catherine, who was carrying their daughter. Their son trailed behind, clutching a handheld game device. James looked exactly as I expected, perfectly groomed, expensive watch, confident posture. Catherine matched him in polished appearance, her blonde hair styled in a sophisticated bob, her outfit clearly designer. "Harper," James said with a nod that fell somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal. "Long time." "James," I replied, continuing to peel potatoes. "Nice to see you." Catherine approached with more warmth, shifting their daughter to offer me a one-armed hug. "Harper, we've heard you're doing so well with your photography in New York." The statement surprised me, as it implied conversations about my career that I doubted had actually occurred. My mother's slight frown confirmed my suspicion. The children regarded me with curiosity. 5-year-old William barely remembered me, while 3-year-old Emma had no recollection at all. "Are you really our aunt?" William asked, looking up from his game briefly. "Daddy says you make pictures." "I am," I confirmed, crouching to his level. "And yes, I'm a photographer. Would you like to see some pictures I've taken?" He shrugged with the casual indifference of a child, but Emma nodded enthusiastically. I pulled out my phone and showed them a series of animal photographs I had taken at the Central Park Zoo. Emma laughed delightedly at a particularly expressive monkey, while William showed grudging interest in a snow leopard. "Children, come help Grandpa bring in the presents from the car," my mother interrupted, effectively ending the moment of connection. As the morning progressed, more guests arrived: my father's brother and his wife, 2 couples who were longtime family friends, and my mother's sister with her husband. The house filled with conversation and the mingled scents of roasting turkey and baking pies. I found myself observing interactions from a distance, noting how my parents proudly introduced James to guests who hadn't seen him recently. "Our son the doctor," my father would say, beaming. "His practice is already considering him for partnership." When the same guests were introduced to me, the language shifted subtly but significantly. "Our daughter," my mother would say, with no elaboration on my accomplishments. If guests inquired about my life in New York, she would quickly redirect the conversation. Several of the guests, however, seemed genuinely interested in my work. My Aunt Julia, always the family rebel, asked specific questions about my photography. "I saw your name in a magazine at the dentist's office," she said. During a moment when we found ourselves alone in the hallway, I was so proud I told everyone in the waiting room my niece was featured in a national publication. These moments of recognition felt like oxygen in a stuffy room. They reminded me that my accomplishments were real and valued, even if not by the people whose validation I had once craved most. During a brief moment alone, I slipped upstairs to my bedroom and retrieved the envelope I had prepared the night before. I placed it in my bag, ready for the moment I had decided would come after dinner. I also took the opportunity to photograph the altered family albums, using my professional camera, documenting the systematic removal of my image. These photos weren't for sharing. They were for my own record evidence that I wasn't imagining or exaggerating the rejection. Back downstairs, preparations for the formal meal were reaching their climax. The dining table looked like something from a magazine spread. fine china crystal glasses, silver candlesticks, and an elaborate centerpiece of autumn flowers and gourds. My mother, despite her health concerns, had outdone herself in creating a picture-perfect setting. Before taking our seats, my father insisted on taking formal family photographs in front of the fireplace. I watched as he arranged James, Catherine, and their children in prime positions. "Harper, you stand to the side here," he directed, placing me at the periphery of the group. I suggested several alternative arrangements using my professional knowledge of composition to ensure I wasn't marginalized in these images. Whether from surprise at my assertiveness or simple acceptance, my suggestions were implemented, creating more balanced groupings. Once seated at the table, my father rose to offer the traditional Thanksgiving toast. He held his wineglass aloft, surveying the gathered family and friends with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Today we give thanks for family togetherness," he began, his voice slightly unsteady, "for having all our loved ones around this table." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me given what I had discovered in the family albums. I maintained a neutral expression, sipping my water and waiting for the right moment to address the disconnect between his words and the family's actions. The meal progressed through multiple courses, with conversation flowing around topics of politics, local news, and the children's activities. I participated minimally, responding when addressed directly, but otherwise observing the dynamics with newfound clarity. The envelope in my bag seemed to generate its own gravity, pulling at my awareness throughout the elaborate dinner. As dessert was being served, 3 different pies with homemade ice cream, I decided the time had come. I excused myself briefly and returned with one of the family albums and my prepared envelope. The conversation dimmed as I placed the album on the table next to my dessert plate. Curiosity and confusion registered on several faces. "I found something interesting last night," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "I thought we might discuss it." My mother's eyes darted to the album, then away. A flush spread across her cheeks as she realized what was about to happen. My father froze with his fork midway to his mouth. "Harper, this isn't the time," my mother said quietly but firmly. "We have guests." "Actually, I think it's the perfect time," I replied, opening the album to a page where several photos had been torn out, leaving jagged edges. I was hoping someone could explain why every single photo of me has been removed from the family albums. The table fell silent. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly finding their desserts fascinating. James shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I was just reorganizing," my mother said dismissively. "Some photos were faded or damaged." "All of them? In every album?" I turned the pages slowly, revealing page after page of deliberate removal. "That seems unlikely," Catherine gasped softly, looking genuinely shocked. My Aunt Julia frowned deeply, shooting my mother a disapproving look. "I checked every album spanning more than 20 years. I continued, my voice steady. "It's quite systematic. I've documented all of it in case anyone's curious." My father cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Harper." "Why? It wasn't done privately. It was done to our shared family history." I closed the album gently. "I'm not here to create drama. I just want to understand." My mother's composure began to crack. "You always do this. Turn everything into a spectacle. Make everything about you." "That's an interesting perspective," I said. "Considering I've been physically removed from the family narrative, it seems like a lot of effort went into making sure nothing was about me." James surprisingly spoke up. "Mum, you can't deny this looks bad. Really bad." My mother turned to him, betrayal flashing across her face at his failure to automatically take her side. "You don't understand. She abandoned this family, chose a completely different life, rejected everything we value." "I chose my own path," I corrected. "That's not rejection, it's independence." "You've been punishing her for not becoming who you wanted," my father said quietly, surprising everyone at the table, perhaps himself most of all. "Margaret, you've resented Harper since she was a child, since she started showing artistic talent instead of following James's academic path." My mother's face paled. "That's completely untrue." "It is true," he insisted, his voice gaining strength. "You've always seen her as competition rather than as our daughter. I've watched it happen for decades and I've said nothing. That's on me." James shifted uncomfortably before adding, "I've always known I was the favourite. It was obvious, Mum. I just never said anything because, well, it benefited me." The confession hung in the air, validating decades of my experience. It wasn't just in my head. It wasn't hypersensitivity. The dynamics I had felt were real enough that even the beneficiary had recognized them. I reached for my bag and pulled out the envelope I had prepared. "Since I'm not in the family album, I thought you might want these instead." I placed it on the table and slid it toward my parents. My mother stared at it as though it might contain something dangerous. My father finally reached for it and opened the flap. Inside were the magazine features, gallery announcements, newspaper reviews, and professional accolades I had accumulated over the years. On top was a family portrait I had commissioned from a fellow artist showing what a supportive family might look like, parents proudly surrounding a daughter whose creative path they celebrated. My mother pulled out the items one by one, her hands trembling slightly. The evidence of my success achieved without their support or acknowledgement spread across the table. The most recent magazine feature included a full-page photograph of me in my studio, described as one of the most promising photographic voices of her generation. Tears welled in my mother's eyes as she stared at the materials. Not tears of pride or joy, but something more complicated. Perhaps regret. Perhaps the painful recognition of opportunities lost. My father sat completely still, a muscle working in his jaw as he examined a glowing review from a prominent art critic. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I didn't know," Catherine said softly, looking at a gallery announcement. "James, did you know Harper was this successful?" James shook his head, looking genuinely surprised. "No, I knew she was working as a photographer, but not this." The fact that my own brother had no idea about my professional achievements, despite them being publicly available information, spoke volumes about the family's lack of interest in my life. "I didn't come here to make anyone feel bad," I said, breaking the silence. "I came because I was told Mum wanted to see me, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't act like it's normal or acceptable to be systematically erased from family history." My Aunt Julia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good for you, Harper. It's about time someone said it." My mother abruptly stood up, napkin falling to the floor, and left the room. My father hesitated, then followed her. The remaining guests exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure of proper etiquette for a Thanksgiving dinner that had evolved into a family therapy session. I gathered the album and the contents of the envelope. "I think I'll go pack my things. I'll be staying at the Holiday Inn tonight." As I stood, James caught my wrist. "Harper, wait. Don't go yet." I looked at him, this brother who had been both beneficiary and bystander to my exclusion. "What's left to say, James?" "A lot, actually." He replied, his typical confidence faltering. "We should talk, really talk." I nodded, not committing to anything but acknowledging the offer. Then I turned and walked upstairs to my childhood bedroom, feeling strangely light despite the heaviness of the confrontation. For the first time in that house, I had spoken my truth without apology or qualification. Whatever happened next, I had reclaimed my narrative. The drive to the Holiday Inn felt like crossing a boundary between past and future. Each mile increased the distance not just from the physical house, but from the emotional patterns that had defined my family relationships for decades. In the rental car, alone with my thoughts, I finally allowed the tears that had been building all evening to flow freely. These weren't tears of sadness exactly, though there was grief in them. They were tears of release, of letting go. I had entered my parents' house, carrying the weight of unmet expectations and unspoken hurt. I was leaving with that burden somewhat lightened, having finally given voice to what had long been silenced. At the hotel, I checked into a standard room with bland decor and anonymous comfort. The generic space felt more welcoming than my preserved childhood bedroom had. I sent a text to Zoe, updating her on what had happened, then took a long shower, symbolically washing away the residue of the confrontation. My phone buzzed with multiple notifications while I was in the bathroom. Text from James asking where I was staying. A missed call from my father. A message from my Aunt Julia telling me she was proud of me and had given Margaret a piece of her mind after I left. I responded only to James confirming my location, but making no promises about further conversation. I wasn't opposed to talking with him, but I needed space to process everything that had happened. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night. Perhaps the emotional exertion had simply exhausted me, or maybe speaking my truth had released tension I'd carried for years. Whatever the reason, I slept deeply until morning light filtered through the hotel curtains. Around 9 the next morning, a knock at my hotel room door startled me. Looking through the peephole, I was surprised to see my father standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes, a paper bag in his hand. I opened the door cautiously. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you." "I brought breakfast," he said, lifting the bag slightly. "Just some bagels and coffee. Can I come in to talk?" I hesitated before stepping back to allow him entry. He placed the bag on the small desk by the window and remained standing as though unsure of his welcome. "How did you know where to find me?" I asked. "James told me," he admitted. "I hope that's okay." I nodded, taking one of the coffees from the bag. The familiar logo was from the local bakery I had loved as a teenager. It was a small detail, but significant, that he had remembered. "What you showed us yesterday," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Your work, your success. I had no idea, Harper. That's on me. I should have known. I should have been paying attention." "Yes, you should have." I agreed, not harshly, but without cushioning the truth. I sent announcements. I shared news. But it never seemed to matter. He sank into the desk chair, suddenly looking older than his 68 years. "I failed you, not just recently, but throughout your life. I saw what was happening with your mother, how she treated you differently, and I did nothing." "Why?" I asked the question that had haunted me for years. Why do you think she singled me out that way?" My father sighed deeply. "It's not simple. Margaret had dreams of being an artist when she was young. Did you know that she wanted to study painting, but her parents insisted on a practical degree in education? She resented that limitation her entire life. This was new information, a piece of the puzzle I hadn't considered. When you showed artistic talent," he continued, "I think it triggered something in her. Jealousy, perhaps, or the pain of her own abandoned dreams. Instead of supporting you, you experienced how she reacted. That doesn't justify erasing me from family photos," I pointed out. "Nothing justifies that," he agreed quickly. I don't know when she started doing that. I noticed some missing photos maybe a year ago, but didn't realize the extent. I should have questioned it. I should have stopped it." The acknowledgement was something, though it came decades too late. We sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken years stretching between us. "I'm not looking for apologies that can't change the past," I finally said. "I just want honesty going forward, and respect for the boundaries I need to set." "What boundaries?" he asked cautiously. "I won't pretend everything is fine. I won't subject myself to environments where I'm made to feel less than. I won't accept being erased or dismissed." I took a sip of coffee before continuing. "If there's going to be any relationship moving forward, it has to be based on mutual respect. That includes respect for my career choices, my life in New York, and who I am as a person." My father nodded slowly. "That's more than fair. I can't speak for your mother, but I want to do better, Harper. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." There was a vulnerability in his request that I had rarely seen from him. The man before me wasn't the passive bystander of my childhood, but someone acknowledging his failures and expressing a desire to change. Whether that desire would translate into meaningful action remained to be seen. "I'm not making any promises," I told him honestly, "but I'm willing to see what happens if we try a different approach, starting with small steps." Relief washed across his face. "Small steps. Yes, that's fair." We talked for another hour, covering ground that had long been left unexplored. He asked genuine questions about my work, my life in New York, my friends. I showed him more photographs on my laptop explaining my artistic process and the stories behind certain images. He listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. When he left, the air between us felt different. Not healed, certainly, but perhaps beginning to mend in ways I hadn't thought possible. I returned to New York the following day, declining James's last-minute invitation to have dinner with his family. That was a relationship that would require its own careful navigation, and I wasn't ready to tackle it immediately after the confrontation with my parents. Back in my small but light-filled apartment, surrounded by my photographs and the life I had built independently, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and liberation. The Thanksgiving confrontation had drained me emotionally, but it had also freed something long trapped inside. In the weeks that followed, I channeled this energy into a new photography project, exploring the concept of absence and presence in family narratives. The series, titled Erasure, featured manipulated family photographs with figures removed, shadowed or highlighted to represent the emotional dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. This work became my most personal and ultimately my most acclaimed. Gallery owners responded to its emotional authenticity and critics praised its technical skill and conceptual depth. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, Erasure opened as a solo exhibition at a prestigious gallery in Chelsea. During this period, I maintained limited but more honest communication with my father. We exchanged occasional emails and had brief phone conversations that no longer followed the old scripts of avoidance and surface-level pleasantries. He made efforts to ask about my work and share his own thoughts without judgment. My mother was a different story. After the confrontation, she had withdrawn completely, refusing any direct communication. My father reported that she was processing, but offered little other information. I wasn't surprised and didn't push for a reconciliation that neither of us was ready for. Then 6 months after Thanksgiving, I received an email directly from her. It was brief and formal, but contained something I had never expected: an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. "I have not been fair to you," she wrote. "I am not ready to discuss everything, but I want you to know I recognize that my actions have caused harm. The albums were inexcusable. It wasn't an apology exactly, and it certainly didn't address the decades of favoritism and dismissal, but it was a crack in the wall of denial that had characterized our relationship." I responded with equal brevity, acknowledging her message without promising immediate forgiveness. James and I began rebuilding a relationship independent of our parents. He visited New York with his family, and I gave them a tour of my studio and favorite city spots. His children were delighted by the energy of the city, and Catherine expressed genuine interest in my work. James seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time, not through the lens of family hierarchy, but as an individual with her own valid path. "I always envied your courage," he admitted during a quiet moment while the children were distracted by street performers in Washington Square Park. "Following your passion despite everything. I never had that kind of bravery." The admission surprised me. "You always seem so confident in your path." "The path was laid out for me," he replied. "I just walked it. That's not the same as choosing your own way." Our relationship would never be close in the conventional sense. Too much history stood between us for that. But we developed a mutual respect that allowed for authentic interaction rather than performative family roles. 1 year after the Thanksgiving confrontation, I was preparing for the opening night of my newest exhibition. The gallery was buzzing with final preparations, lighting being adjusted, catering arranged. I was discussing placement details with the curator when I looked up to see my father standing hesitantly near the entrance. "Dad?" I said, genuinely surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." "I should have called first," he said, looking around at the sophisticated gallery space. "I didn't want to intrude, but I wanted to see your work in person, to understand it properly." The gesture touched me deeply. He had flown to New York specifically to attend my opening, something that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. I gave him a private tour of the exhibition, explaining the concepts behind each series. He asked thoughtful questions and observed with careful attention. When we reached the Erasure series, inspired by my experience with the family albums, he stood silently for a long time. "It's powerful," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've transformed pain into something beautiful. That takes remarkable strength, Harper." The acknowledgement of both the pain and the strength required to overcome it felt like a significant step in our evolving relationship. My mother did not attend the exhibition, but she sent a small arrangement of flowers with a card that read simply, "Congratulations. Kikau." It was minimal but meaningful given our history. That Thanksgiving, I did not return to Chicago. Instead, I hosted a dinner in my apartment for my chosen family, Zoe, Maya, Sophia, and other friends who had supported me through years of struggle and success. We ate takeout turkey from a local restaurant, drank too much wine, and shared stories of our own complicated family histories. As I looked around at these people who had chosen to be in my life, who celebrated my successes without qualification and supported me through difficulties without judgment, I realized that family isn't defined by DNA, but by actions. These people had earned the designation of family through consistent love and respect. The painful discovery in my parents' house had ultimately led to greater authenticity in all my relationships. I no longer accepted conditional love or measured approval. I no longer dimmed my light to make others comfortable. I set clear boundaries and held both myself and others accountable to them. The journey wasn't complete, and likely never would be. Family relationships continue to evolve throughout life, shaped by new experiences and changing perspectives. But I had found a path forward based on truth rather than pretense, on self-respect rather than desperate approval-seeking. Standing in my truth had cost me the comfort of illusions, but had given me something far more valuable, the freedom to be fully myself, whether or not that version fit anyone else's expectations. Have you ever had to confront a painful family truth? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please give this video a like and subscribe to hear more stories about finding strength through difficult family dynamics. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stand firmly in your own truth even when it's painful.